Hello, Minnesota Realtors. Thank you for joining me today. Today, I'm going to be sharing with you what we've changed for 2020 in our forms, Minnesota Realtors forms. Our forms committee has been busy again this year looking at all of your suggested changes, even operating remotely in this pandemic times. There were many suggested changes that were considered, but not too many changes actually made on the actual forms this year. But this webinar is to summarize for you those substantive changes that will be rolling out here coming up in August. So just to begin, an overview of all of the forms that have changed. If you recall, back in March, we released a new form, the Addendum Amendment to Purchase Agreement for Coronavirus Disease 2019. We also made some modification to all of our addenda and amendments. We also modified the representation and facilitator services agreements. We always have a change to that disclosure statement, seller's property disclosure statement, and we also modified the vacant land disclosure this year as well. We made a few changes to the purchase agreements, including the residential, new construction, and vacant land, and we also modified the residential lease this year. On the commercial side, vast majority of the changes we made are very similar to what we did on the residential side, so we modified the addenda and amendments, the representation contracts, and the purchase agreements as well. And I'll go through some of the details here now as far as more of the substantive changes. But just beginning with the new form, the addendum or amendment to purchase agreement coronavirus disease. Like as I mentioned, we had released this back in March of this year in response to the pandemic. This was really created to assist you and your clients in extending the deadlines in the purchase agreement if there is a COVID-19 related event that would inhibit a party's ability to perform under their current purchase agreement. So in other words, we're trying to save this purchase agreement, keep it intact, and then also provide some security for those people who are uncertain about whether they wanted to enter into a purchase agreement at this time due to all things pandemic. So as you can see in this particular form, we have defined what a COVID-related event means. And the bulk of this is just extending the current deadlines that are in the purchase agreement. That doesn't excuse their performance under the current purchase agreement. It just says that in the event that we have a COVID-related event, one party can give the other party written notice of that, and then this extension date will kick in. And then if we get to the end of that extension date, if the parties can either choose to extend it again, or either party can choose to cancel that purchase agreement. So I do want to note here, though, that our forms committee did consider whether or not to add a reference at the end of the purchase agreement where we reference the list of addenda, whether we wanted to reference this particular addendum there. And the forms committee chose not to do that in the hopes that this is a short-term issue. And so if you are going to be utilizing this addendum as part of the purchase agreement, be good practice to make sure that you're noting that in the purchase agreement somewhere in the other section, and note that this addendum would be part of the purchase agreement and make sure it's attached, signed and attached. So moving on to all of the addenda and the amendments, the main change for all of them, which is why they all changed, was a clarification as far as what date we are referencing on line 6 of these addenda and amendments, or whatever line it is in that particular form. But as you can see, it states that the addendum to the purchase agreement between the parties dated, and we just clarified that what we mean by that is the date of this purchase agreement. And just as a reminder, we define that in our purchase agreement. The date of this purchase agreement means the date that's listed on line 1 of the purchase agreement, generally the offer date. All right, as far as more substantive changes to the addendum, the CIC addendum, you'll note that we added some language here to clarify. This was actually a statutory change that was reflected in the CIC statute. So in the past, when a buyer wanted to initiate a statutory cancellation, that they had the right to do, that 10-day rescission period, they actually had to either hand deliver that written notice or mail the notice. And there was, our association pursued a legislative change here, and now the buyer is able to send their notice, rescission notice, to the seller as long as that seller's agent has provided them with an email address that they can send it to. On the counteroffer addendum, we made a couple of changes. First and foremost, we added a clarifying sentence here. Specifically, this counteroffer addendum is valid only upon signature and delivery of the purchase agreement. This was an important distinction, and you'll hear me talk about later in the purchase agreement our clarifications about what's the entire agreement. Well, this is kind of part of that. We want to make sure that when we are having a counteroffer addendum, in our counteroffer addendum, what we are doing is we are rejecting that other person's purchase agreement. We are making a new offer to that other party, and we are including all of the other terms in the purchase agreement along with the new ones that are in the counteroffer addendum. So it's important that we make sure that when we are stating we're giving a counteroffer addendum, that we have the counteroffer addendum signed, the purchase agreement that we're referring to, that's signed. We have it all together and all delivered at the same time to the other party. That way we understand exactly what that offer is on that purchase agreement. We know what the terms of the purchase agreement are. We know what the terms of the counteroffer addendum are, and there's no confusion or disputes about whether or not we have a valid contract here. The other change we made on the counteroffer addendum is we added the ability for you to put the final acceptance date on the counteroffer addendum itself. And you'll also see later on that we added a reference to that in our purchase agreement so that it's noted the final acceptance dates. If there is a counteroffer addendum, you can note the final acceptance date there. In the representation and facilitator services agreement, we made a couple of changes, kind of minor, but just really for clarification purposes. Wherever we're defining the client, so the seller, the buyer, etc., you'll see that we just put in some examples. Is this an individual? Is this an estate? Is this a trust or a corporation? The point here is that we need to understand who the actual seller is. So the owner, for example, if it happened to be a corporation that owned it, we want to make sure that we're clear that we're representing that corporation, not the individual who might be signing on behalf of the corporation. So the Forms Committee put that in there for clarification purposes and to prompt to make sure that everybody is being clear there. We also modified the consent for communication section just to clarify that the client is consenting to receive text messages from you. Also on the listing contract, you'll notice that in the signature section, we added a marital status question. And you'll see that we actually removed it from the purchase agreement and put it here instead for a couple of reasons. Obviously, number one, as you all know, 1 to buy, 2 to sell. If there is a married, if we have married owners of the property, we're going to need both of them to agree to be entering into this listing contract and be agreeing to sell this particular piece of property. And the second component of that is that's coming up frequently, or that we're hearing about, is the issue of FIRPTA. So in other words, we need to know the marital status up front. It's apparently not too uncommon where we have a U.S. citizen who's married to a foreign person, and if that foreign person, we need to know the marital status so that it might have FIRPTA implications later down the road. So important to know at the listing contract state of things. So we added that to our signature section. All right, seller's property disclosure statement. Actually, there weren't a whole lot of changes this year, just one really for clarification purposes. We had heard that this section, the appliance, heating, plumbing, mechanical system section was just a little bit too confusing. And so the Forms Committee tried to rearrange this a little bit so that, and reword it a little bit so that hopefully it's a little more clear for those consumers who are filling this out. So NA, if it's not, check NA if it's not physically located on the property. And then, and you'll see that we moved that to the front of the line there. So if we don't have air conditioning, which is too bad in these few days, but if you didn't have air conditioning, obviously you'd be checking NA there. And then the next two columns, obviously, whether this is in working order, presuming it's physically located on the property. So we're hoping that this rearrangement will make it a little bit more clear for our sellers to complete. On the disclosure statement of vacant land, there was a particular provision in here that created some questions and controversies. So it was reviewed by the Forms Committee, and they decided to eliminate this language. We had language in there previously that stated that gardens and new tree plantings will be at least 30 feet from the surrounding property lines bordering any agricultural field. And the Forms Committee decided to eliminate that provision from the vacant land disclosure statement. All right, moving to our purchase agreement. This is our residential purchase agreement. Personal property section, as usual, continues to be tweaked and modified as I know this is a particularly difficult section to deal with for you and your transactions. So we're always trying to do our best to make this work for the vast majority of transactions. So the Forms Committee reviewed this section again, and you'll see that we added a few things here for clarification purposes. Number one is that in-ground pet containment systems. So keep your dog in or in bounds, and you'll notice that we did clarify that it would exclude any collars. We also made modification to the ceiling speaker mounts. Previously in this particular section, you'll note that we actually had ceiling speaker mounts, but we also had the ceiling speakers themselves, ceiling mounted speakers. So in other words, what the Forms Committee has done here is saying the ceiling speaker mounts, those that are holding the speaker, those will be staying, but the speakers themselves, if they happen to be mounted there and could be removed out of the mount, then they would be not included in the sale of the with the real property. So that's an important change in the event you run into any ceiling speakers, something you want to take note of there. Another big issue that we're seeing increasingly as technology becomes smaller and more integrated, you'll see that we added some language regarding that smart home technology. So all integrated phone and home automation systems, including any necessary components such as internet and internet connected hardware or devices, control units, other than non-dedicated mobile devices, electronics and computers, and any applicable software, permissions, passwords, codes, etc., or access information. So that Nest that's on the wall or that garage door opener that's connected with your app, all of those types of things we're clarifying. If it's integrated into the home, it's going to be transferring with the property. Again, these are anything other than non-dedicated mobile devices. So this isn't like your phone doesn't have to go with it, your computer doesn't have to go with it necessarily, but you're certainly going to have to be providing passwords, permission codes, access information. And then if there is hardware that's directly connected to the property, obviously that is going to be transferred with the real property. So that was a very important addition to our personal property section this year. In the financing section of the residential purchase agreement, you'll see we made a couple of changes. We combined conventional or privately insured conventional into one line. We used to have them listed as separately, but there appeared to be some confusion about when to check that conventional versus privately insured conventional in the financing contingency section here of the purchase agreement. So just a reminder that a conventional loan is a loan that is not backed by a particular government program, and that conventional loan generally requires a 20% down payment. And a conventional loan where the buyer is putting a down payment of less than 20%, that will typically require a mortgage insurance, or that's why we call it the privately insured conventional. So when the wrong one was checked in here, we had some disputes arising about whether or not the buyer fulfilled their obligation to seek out the proper loan, and whether they could cancel the purchase agreement. So the Forms Committee looked at this issue and decided that we should just combine these two so that we don't have any issues as to whether or not the buyer has the choice to do conventional or privately insured conventional. And so we just combined that onto one line there. The other change we made, just a clarifying change in the DVA funding fee section, you'll notice that we added some language clarifying that the funding fee is based on the loan amount. As you know, this is a one-time funding fee that is actually a percentage of the loan amount, and that percentage is based upon the type of loan and the borrower's military category. So the Forms Committee considered whether or not to add language here requiring like a percentage amount be placed in there, but instead they decided just to add some clarifying language that the funding fee is based on the loan amount, and then the blank line could be utilized to write either the dollar amount after you've figured out that percentage amount, or you could write it as a percentage of the loan amount. So just a clarifying point there, and you could write it either way. All right. We also made some modified some language throughout the purchase agreement. Anywhere we had reference that we had a previously written purchase agreement is what we had before. We modified that to state previously executed purchase agreement. Again, this is just a nuanced interpretation here of whether or not when we said previously written agreement, there was some question whether or not it could have referred to any offer, that even if an offer was never accepted. So for clarification purposes, you'll see that we modified that to state previously executed purchase agreement now. We also made a change to the risk of loss section. Although this might seem like a small change, it certainly will affect the interpretation here significantly. So currently, in our current purchase agreement, we have language that states that the risk of loss is on the seller for any damage to the property between the final acceptance date and the date of closing. So there's this gap that we have between the date of the purchase agreement and the final acceptance date, this period of time when you made the offer versus when we actually sign that final acceptance purchase agreement and deliver it to the other party. So there's this little time period that was sort of lost there, and the forms committee decided that in order to fix that gap, that we're going to change the language here so that if there's any loss or damage to the property between the date of purchase agreement and the date of closing, then that risk of loss is on the seller. So we've bumped that up, being originally what we currently have is the date of final acceptance date. We've moved that up to be the date of the purchase agreement. That would be on line 1. All right, we also clarified what we mean by a fully executed purchase agreement and final acceptance. So you'll see that in order to be binding, the purchase agreement and all addenda must be fully executed by both parties, and a copy must be delivered to the other party. This is a very important clarification. So in other words, if you are going to be checking something and that there's an addendum, a particular addendum as part of the purchase agreement, you need to make sure that we have that addendum attached, and it has to be fully executed by both parties, and a copy has to be delivered to the other party. So very clear here, if you've checked that box or that there's an addenda attached but we don't have it, we no longer have a fully executed purchase agreement. So very important clarification here, and important to make sure you are very diligent about ensuring all of the addenda are completed and delivered to the other party as part of the purchase agreement. As I had mentioned earlier, we also modified the counteroffer addendum section, and you'll see that we added language to state that you can check here that if the purchase agreement is subject to a counteroffer addendum, and if so, you can put the final acceptance date on that counteroffer addendum. Finally, as I noted earlier as well, you'll see that we removed the marital status from the purchase agreement, with the understanding and belief that we just need to make sure we need to know that information much earlier than the purchase agreement time frame. All right, on the new construction purchase agreement, you'll see that we modified this form throughout to allow for the form to be used in those circumstances where the buyer is purchasing a lot and they want a new construction property on it. Currently, our new construction purchase agreement only allows for the opportunity for the builder to build new. So this is modified so that you could use this form if there's a new construction already completed, or if there's a new construction that's already in process. So we haven't even, we've already started the construction process, but it's just not complete. So you'll notice that throughout this particular form, we've modified it so that this form can be utilized in all 3 of those circumstances. So to be built, partially completed, or already completed new construction that hasn't been inhabited. Just a note on line 249 as well, you'll see that we modified the price protection section so that if the purchase agreement is contingent and the home is not yet completed, obviously the purpose of that is costs of materials oftentimes. So you'll see that we've clarified that particular section as well. And then on the residential lease, you might recall that we modified this last year, and that was a result of some legislative changes that required that in a written residential lease, you're required to identify the lease start date and the lease end date. Well, we wanted to, it was implemented very quickly by the legislature after the governor's signature. So we wanted to go back. We removed, at that time, we removed the ability to have that month-to-month lease, and we wanted to read through our current lease and make sure that we had the ability to do that, and drafted this current language to add in the terms of lease section so that we can specify that the period of time starting on a particular date and ending on the last day of the month, but automatically renewing. So we have that month-to-month provision in there that you can utilize in your residential lease now. And if you can believe it, that is all we have for substantive changes to the residential forms. Just to quickly go over the commercial forms changes, as I already mentioned on the residential side, we did develop also a COVID-19 addendum and amendment for the commercial purchase agreement. We also eliminated the privately insured conventional on the commercial side. Our commercial forms subcommittee indicated that that is just not generally used on the commercial side, so that was actually completely removed. And then in the representation contracts, similar to what we did on the residential side, you'll see that we added those examples when we're trying to define the client, and we added the consent to text messaging. And then in our purchase agreement, we did add some language similar to what we had in our purchase agreement vacant land, that the buyer is not relying on any oral representations made regarding the property. We also removed references to facilitator, since that's really a statutorily defined concept for residential transactions in Chapter 82. And so we removed that from our commercial purchase agreement. And then we modified this, as we did in the residential side. We clarified that all addenda and the purchase agreement must be fully executed and delivered to the other party to be binding. And then we, throughout the purchase agreement as well, we changed that previously written to previously executed throughout. And those are the substantive changes that will be coming out. We hope to have them out by our usual August 1st, 2020 release. They have been submitted to Instanet for modifications, so we are hoping to post them August 1st. And I want to thank you all for watching, and stay well.